This episode of New Politics was released on the 14th of December, 2024, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Welcome to New Politics. In this episode, we look at all the big issues that influence federal politics throughout the year, the highs and lows, all the things that really mattered and all the things that didn't. I'm Eddie Djokovic, editor of New Politics.
I'm David Lewis, Skrillex Remix.
And just our regular message, listen in, share, subscribe and support New Politics at Patreon and Substack, or you can donate at our website at newpolitics.com.au. And of course, all of this is a good way to support independent journalism. It's been a fascinating year in Australian politics, and there were a few themes that have been consistent over the past couple of years. The economy is usually at the forefront of most political discussions, and while it's not great at the moment, it is trying to address the years of neglect under the coalition government and then the after effects of the economy from the beginning of the COVID pandemic in early 2020. And for all of those people who were saying, oh, that's just a partisan comment. Well, no, the economy was really in poor condition in late 2019, just before the pandemic commenced. And there's a lot of calibrations that have had to be made to the economy after the coalition left office in 2022. And I think this is the stage that the economy is going through at the moment. And despite that, the economy is spluttering along. Economic growth is expected to be 1.6% at the end of this year. That's avoiding the technical definition of a recession, although GDP per capita has actually gone backwards over the past 6 quarters. But the big issue is the focus on interest rates. And the Reserve Bank didn't change the interest rate at its monthly meeting this week, which means that the interest rate has been the same for the entire year. And the performance of the Reserve Bank has also been the focus of attention for most of this year. There is a feeling that they should have lowered the interest rate to stimulate the economy, but overall the economy hasn't been performing as well as it could. So there's still a lot of focus in the media about the cost of living pressures. Levels of unemployment are still low and steady, so it's not all terrible news. But the big focus for most of this year has been on interest rates and when they're going to start coming down.
It's pretty clear that the Reserve Bank is not working in the interests of the government, but as a ripple-on effect from that, it's not working for the interests of the Australian people. Interest rates should have gone down 6 months ago. If we're being generous, 3 months ago, and probably by half a point, if not a point. The economy has to be managed in such a way that it moves along. And when they've frozen the rate like that, and apparently they're not even discussing rate cuts at the board. They're just wondering, do they hold them or do they put them up? I think the board is crafty enough to not put them up because that would be an obvious attack on government policy. It's clear the board has to go. The board is not appropriate to the current economy. And I'd either forgotten this, but the Treasurer can override board decisions and set the rate in extraordinary circumstances. Why the Treasurer hasn't done this yet is up for debate. And also what's up for the debate, should the Treasurer? I think the Treasurer should. I think that the higher interest rates are slowing the effects of good economic management. And for all the criticisms we have of the government, their economic management has been good, which you couldn't say of the last government. They didn't manage the economy well at all. This government, yes, they've been supporting a genocide. The treatment of whistleblowers is unconscionable, but they managed the economy well. You can say that about this government. And it might be time for the Treasurer to come in and say, yes, I'm overriding the board. And if the board say, well, that's a big slap in the face to us and we resign on principle, you then write a little memo to them saying, don't let the door hit you on the way out, because we're to that point.
And the other issue is that the government probably shouldn't depend on the Reserve Bank on lowering interest rates to boost its political fortunes, and I guess for two reasons. First of all, we don't know if or when the Reserve Bank will lower interest rates, and they seem to have a hold of this economic data and information that no one else in the world seems to have a hold of. So maybe they've got all of this secret information, because many economic commentators are suggesting that the rate should have come down a few months ago. But I'd say that even if interest rates do come down, the media will either downplay it or spin it as bad news, that it should have happened some time ago, or the coalition would have been much better at lowering interest rates. But there's also the contradictions that we can see within the reporting about the economy. And David, you mentioned this last week, that we've got record pre-Christmas levels of retail spending, yet all this talk about a really bad economy and tough circumstances, there's stable and low inflation, yet the media keeps talking up rising prices on everything. And as you mentioned, David, it has to be one or the other. It can't actually be both. And there's also those issues about the political narrative. And I know that you're not a big fan of the narrative that the media keeps rabbiting on about, but governments do have to tell the story of what they're doing. And the right-wing media certainly isn't going to do that. But the government, and that would be their main leaders, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, and the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, I think they just have to keep talking up and talking about the economy until they go blue in the face, and until they're absolutely sick of talking about it, and until the electorate gets sick of hearing about it. And then they will know that the electorate has finally got the message that the economy isn't performing as badly as being reported, and it's not great, but it's not terrible, and that there are some green shoots appearing. And I think that if they do want to win the next election, this is the tactic that they will just have to keep doing.
They've got to take charge of their story. Instead of waiting to see what the press will say, just do it and let the press do what they will. The press is never going to support the Labor government, no matter how many lunches with Rupert and Lachlan he has, no matter how often he flies Kerry Stokes or whomever to dinner, no matter how much exclusives they give, no matter how many leaks they give, they're going to get the occasional puff piece, which nobody reads, and that's on page 20, and on page 1 it'll be Labor bad, Labor bad. Peter Dutton is the only answer. If Peter Dutton is the only answer, the question must be who has been the worst leader of the opposition since Morrison. But I'm not a majority voice in that. I might be a majority in terms of people who agree with that, but I'm not a majority voice.
And speaking of the media, the behaviour of the mainstream media was as bad as it ever has been during this year. And once again, I think the Labor government has missed an opportunity to make reforms to the media. And we did have that issue during the week where Anthony Albanese did say that News Corporation is working to bring the Labor government down. But he said this after he went to the Murdoch's Christmas party to have a nice little chat with Rupert Murdoch and Lachlan. And I'm not sure where Albanese has been over the past 30 years or so, but this is what News Corporation does. They're out to destroy the Labor Party whenever they're in government. That's what they do, and that's exactly what they're trying to do at the moment. So I'm not sure if Albanese is just reading this out aloud so that the electorate hears it, or if it's directed towards the caucus, but Anthony Albanese, as Prime Minister, has had the chance to do something about this and decided not to, and I think it's a little bit too late to be talking about this now. And some of our audience have asked us, well, what will those changes be? And whatever is going to be introduced isn't really going to stop the behaviour of the mainstream media. But I disagree with that. There are so many things that the federal government could do to reform the media in Australia. There's media ownership laws, there's media concentration, there's media behaviour, strengthening up the Australian Press Council, truth in journalism laws. And even if these things are not going to be implemented, you put the media owners on notice and let them know who's in control. You make serious threats against them, heavy-handed tactics, bullying, because this whole process of appeasement with News Corporation, you know, turning up at Holt Street every 6 months or so and having drinks at the Evening Star just around the corner, that just has not worked out very well for Anthony Albanese. And ignoring all of these issues in the media who attack the government at every opportunity as if these issues don't exist, I just think that that's been one of the biggest problems for this government.
Australia, because we have a relatively small government, 151 seats, Ireland has something like 171 seats, and that's a population of about 6 million people, just to give a sense of proportion of how small our government is. And I'm going back to the start of Federation. Alfred Deakin, our second Prime Minister, used to write an anonymous column for one of the British newspapers in which he would report on what was happening in Australian federal politics, including being highly critical of the Prime Minister, which was him, and his ideas and movements and what was likely to happen. Joseph Lyons, a few years later, was the first Prime Minister to invite journalists round for drinks on a Friday afternoon, and he might show them a movie. Parliament House was the only place in Canberra which wasn't dry. Canberra has different alcohol laws to everywhere else because it was dry. There were no pubs. You had to go to Queanbeyan or Yass to go to a pub. Parliament House, however, and this has had ramifications that reverberate today, was licensed to provide alcohol to its staff and visitors. Menzies arrested journalists he didn't like. Only 2 of them, but that would seem to be too many. One of the reasons that Gough Whitlam was unpopular with Murdoch is because he didn't like Murdoch, and he didn't like Murdoch because he found that Murdoch didn't read books and had no knowledge of culture or literature or even current affairs outside of what he could get a headline out of. Paul Keating, of course, would treat questions that he didn't like with utter contempt. Mostly questions he thought were beneath his answering or that he thought didn't need to be asked. Richard Carlton, he used to smack around, who was a very senior and deeply respected journalist for a long time. He used to smack him round. Laurie Oakes, he used to smack round. John Howard used to have a very good relationship with the press, all the time complaining that the press was against him and that we had this left-wing press in Australia made up of people like News Corp and Fairfax. And of course, Julia Gillard was absolutely pilloried by the press. No government is beyond criticism. And the Gillard government wasn't perfect. But what they hammered her on was stuff that had nothing to do with governance. And that was absolutely wrong.
Oh, well, there's no issue with prime ministers having these contacts and relationships with people within the media. But I guess the point is that for Anthony Albanese, that having all those regular meetings with News Corporation editors, we're just not seeing any tangible results from that. So you'd think, well, what's the point? And I guess Albanese could argue that if he wasn't licking the boots or kissing the rings of Rupert Murdoch and Lachlan Murdoch over at Belvedere Hill, well, the coverage would be much worse, although it's hard to see it being much worse than it actually is. But this old style politicians, newspaper editor relationships, schmooze, going to have lunches with these guys, go to their Christmas parties, you have a nudge and a wink and you say, oh, look, I'll go easy on online gambling laws, not do anything about truth in political advertising, ban under 16s from using social media. And they've also announced a new scheme to force big tech companies like Meta to pay for linking to Australian news websites. And guess who benefits from that? News Corporation, of course. So, I'll do all of that in return for favourable news coverage. And I just think that Albanese has been played like a violin on this. News Corporation gets all of the favours done for it, and Albanese and the Labor government, well, they just get pretty much nothing in return. So that strategy hasn't worked for them. And the way that you make changes to the media and get them to behave is through legislation. You argue your case to caucus and through the parliament and to the community, and then you forcefully push this legislation through. And you do it through legislation because Anthony Albanese just hasn't got the political skill to heavy these people in the media. And I think because of that, they are just running rings about him. And they'd be saying, oh, look at this guy. He gives us everything that we want. We give him nothing in return. He turns up to our Christmas parties. We still give him nothing, but then he keeps giving us more. And it's like some unrequited lover or something like that. They also made fun of him on Sky News when he said that News Corporation was out to get him. So he should have worked these things out a long time ago, but he just hasn't.
A friend of mine describes working for the university as the university is a bad boyfriend. It's not going to ring. When it's finished with you, it will dump you. Doesn't care what you think. The more you try and impress it, the more it'll take from you and the less it'll give. And that's the press. The press in regards to a Labor government is a bad boyfriend. And it's best to dump it and move on to something better. And they already have the mechanisms. I think that if you were to take all the media proprietors to court over character. Which of them are fit to run a media company in Australia? It would be very interesting to see how many would pass the character test. Be very interesting to see how many newspapers and how many TV stations would pass appropriate broadcasting laws. The MEAA's Code of Ethics, at least one of the 10 or 12 segments gets breached every day. Not once a week or not even occasionally, things slip through. Every day. And by not standing up to it and stopping it, they get emboldened and go further and further and further. We've already had suicides and deaths and illnesses and stress and from bad press. So it will get worse in terms of the things they say and the things they do will get worse. But the repercussions can't get any worse.
And while the mainstream media or legacy media has become more diminished, I think it's still got some clout in being able to influence political messaging. And because of this, a decent Prime Minister would have looked at this issue of media reform and put in a very powerful minister in charge of communications. But who have they got? Michelle Rowlands, who has done close to nothing in that portfolio except for turning up to gambling industry functions and receiving donations from the gambling industry. And it's a similar issue with the ABC. The ABC, in my opinion, it just does need some serious reform in its political news and reporting and coverage. But Albanese provided the ABC with extra funds this year with absolutely no strings attached. He did it last year and the year before. And the ABC is publicly owned, but the ABC is consistently anti-Labor and pro-Liberal Party in its reporting, and that's across the board on television, on radio and on its website. And I'm not sure why a Prime Minister would put up with this, because I think that it is a serious problem. And if you're not going to reform the overall media, well, at least reform what you can directly control. Just do what the Liberal Party always does. Put your own people on the board of the ABC, influence the management and change the one-sided behaviour of the ABC. So what does the Labor government do? Well, it puts in Kim Williams as the chair of the board, who has got a long history of working within News Corporation. I just think that he's totally unsuitable. So missed opportunities here, but I just think that this is one of those issues that Anthony Albanese will one day come to regret.
Whitlam said crash through or crash. And I think even if you can't dismantle the system, to damage it, to give it a good smack so it has to stand back a bit because its bottom line is getting hurt worse than it already is. That's something, we didn't kill it, but we gave it a good smack, is a much better legacy than we tried to work with them and it just kept getting worse. And then I was too scared to do anything. I think even your political opponents appreciate when you stand up for something, even if they vehemently disagree with it. You get a lot of people on the left saying Thatcher was one of the worst prime ministers Britain ever had, but at least she had principles that she may or may not have stuck to, but you knew where you stood with her. John Howard here, awful, but you knew where he stood. Paul Keating, you knew where he stood. Bob Hawke, you knew where he stood. Gough Whitlam, you knew where he stood. Robert Menzies, you knew where he stood. The prime ministers who tend not to be remembered well are those who you either knew where they stood and they didn't actually hold it consistently, or you didn't know where they stand. As I say, I think you get a much better response, even from your opponents, for standing up and fighting than you do for not standing up and fighting.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, the best podcast on Australian politics and news commentary. You can support us through Patreon and Substack, and also find us at newpolitics.com.au.
Housing affordability continued to be a big issue throughout the year, but the Labor government seemed to be more consumed by making sure that the Australian Greens didn't get any political benefit in the negotiations over key housing legislation. And we suggested this some time ago. It would have been better if the government had a major housing summit when it first got into office, so it could have all the solutions available to it to announce and promote, even if it was just to give the government some political cover when it comes to these issues. You know, this is what the experts have to say about housing. Here's the consensus. This is what we're going to do. And if the Greens or anyone else is going to push for something different, well, you could say to them, well, this is what the experts have to say. And by the way, Adam Bant, you supported all of this during the housing summit that we had last year. You remember that one? And this is where the political cover could have come in, but they decided not to do that. But what we've had instead has been these piecemeal approaches to housing, with the Housing Affordability Future Fund set up last year and the Build to Rent and Help to Buy programs recently passed through Parliament. And within this discussion, I guess we have to remember that housing is a states and territory issue, but the federal government could have an overall policy direction on this. And generally, it's very unclear what effect the government's actions will have on housing affordability across the country. But even the government might be a bit unclear about what it's trying to achieve. Here's the Housing Minister, Claire O'Neill, speaking with David Marchese from the Hack at Triple J.
What is the goal here in terms of these policies? Is it to bring down house prices? Is that what the government wants to do?
We want to bring house price growth into something sustainable. So we're not trying to bring down house prices, but we don't want to see some of the growth that we've seen in some parts of the country where you're getting double-digit increases in house prices year on year.
Why don't you want to be seeing house prices drop? Because if you're looking to get into the market, if you're a young person looking at what's ahead of you, you definitely want to see house prices come down.
Well, that may be the view of young people. It's not the view of our government. We want to see sustainable price growth. We want to see more houses come online. We want to see that rental vacancy rate go up a bit because that will relieve pressure on renters. And we certainly want to see more homeowners. And the government has taken action on all of those pieces this
Minister,
week.
if house prices don't come down, doesn't that mean that this system is stacked against young people, that it's just not going to work for them?
Sure. And Dave, we may have a difference of view about this. I have a strong view. Our government's policies are not going to reduce house prices. We want house prices to grow sustainably.
And I think it might be a case of saying the quiet bit out aloud. The median house price in Sydney is currently $1.6 million. So if that goes up sustainably, whatever that means, that's still unaffordable. And even if those prices drop by, say, 10, 15%, that's still around $1.4 million as the median price, or paying around $2,000 per week if you've got a mortgage. So it is a big issue, but whatever the government has done on this, and housing is an issue that changes very, very, very slowly, that's not going to be a tangible difference leading into the next federal election.
It's not an easy solution, and there's not a really obvious solution, I don't think. For people who've owned for more than, say, 10 years and who've paid off a good proportion of their mortgage and who bought it $500,000 and their house is now worth $1 million, if the price was to drop 20%, which is disastrous, that takes it down to $800,000. If you ignore the interest, which everybody does in these things, you're still ahead. Why don't we do that? We'll just manage the prices down 20%, and that gives people a better chance of getting into the market. And if you bought last year, where the housing price was $1 million, and it drops 20%, and you're behind and you're paying essentially dead money into a loan that will take longer to pay off for less response. The big error was the Howard government turning property into an investment commodity.
Oh, well, there's so many different ways of looking at it, but I think generally it's just hard to know where this debate about housing is all heading. Housing is an incredibly complex area, just with so many different vested interests involved and with 3 different levels of government involved in Australia, and each of them are dealing with different degrees of politics as well. But the federal government is the most powerful out of all of these governments, and they could do things such as direct states and councils to work towards more land release, but it is a complex area. The New South Wales government has already started scaling back plans to build 322,000 new homes across Sydney by 2029, and there's just always going to be political pressures, community resistance to these sorts of developments, and then there's the cost of governments doing all of this. And my feeling is that governments in Australia, well, they're always in the process of reinventing the wheel on housing. As if Australia is the only country that has got this problem, why don't they look at other countries and see what they're doing? You look at Austria, look at Netherlands, Germany. They've got excellent sustainable housing projects and public housing models which do provide affordable housing solutions. And I realise that every country is going to have different circumstances, and why not look at other countries that have correctly identified these problems and applied the correct solutions. But Australia hasn't really identified what the problem is and what we are trying to achieve. Is it to ensure everyone's got a roof over their head? Is it low-cost housing? Is it sustainable cities? Is it to reduce property prices, or is it to increase property prices, as Minister Claire O'Neil suggested? And my feeling is that if you can't define what the problem specifically is, it's just really hard to apply the correct solution.
It's certainly not easy. You have a lot of vested interests who want to maintain housing prices. New homeowners don't want to suddenly see their house is worth a lot less than what they paid for it last year or even this year, even though they should be there for the long term, and over time the house should, or the property should, increase in value. We are hardwired for short-term panic, and that has electoral issues. People aren't really prepared to look at and see, well, okay, $5,000 at this point is nothing. Next year it'll be worth an extra $10,000, which means I've made my money back. And then the year after, and then by the end, 20 years down the track, you've made equity. And of course, equity is funny money. It only becomes realised if you sell the house. So this whole notion, we've got to reset our thinking to allow for the fact that a small loss over 1 or 2 years is part of the cycle of things, and there's nothing to worry about.
But that's one of the key issues within housing. But I guess the issue that I'm identifying is that the government overall, it hasn't worked out what problems it's trying to solve. Like, it's trying to just do this piecemeal approach to everything, but specifically hasn't said, well, this is what we want to do. We want to make sure that everyone has got a roof over their head. And if you decide that that's what you're going to do, well, then you work out your policies from there. But at the moment, it's just all over the place. It's all of those different things, but it's none of those different things at the same time.
Yeah, I think they're listening too much to, again, the press. Magazines like Domain, whose whole raison d'etre is an ever-rising, booming property market where they can sell advertising. Domain, owned by Fairfax. Local papers like Real Estate Agents too, because they buy a lot of advertising space. Developers want that they spend so much and get back more really quickly. I think we need to have a symposium without developers, with heritage consultants, with town planners, proper town planners, not developer town planners, with councils, with the relevant federal and state departments and bodies, with ACOS, and sit down and work out the problem and work out how to solve the problems. I think at the moment there's too many classless nobodies pushing the system rather than the people who need the system and who will benefit most, not monetarily, but socially and culturally and basically from the system, to work out the problems with the system and then how to fix them. We'll hopefully go towards stopping rapacious development, destroying communities, destroying livelihoods, preventing people getting towards secure housing. And again, this goes back to, we've got to dismantle neoliberalism. It's failed, and where it's most obviously failed is in housing policy.
There's been a series of world events throughout the year that have had some effect in Australia, and I guess the big event in world politics for many people was the United States election, and that resulted in the election of Donald Trump as president. And I think we'll just have to wait to see how that plays out next year. And quite a few of our audience get depressed about US politics, so we won't say too much more about that. The relationship with China has been completely stabilised, and all of those trade barriers and sanctions that were placed on the Australian goods because of the actions of Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton in 2020 has finally been lifted, and perhaps the Labor government might like to remind the electorate about how damaging Peter Dutton can be to Australia's national interest during the next federal election campaign. But for me, the biggest international issue that affected local politics is the genocide in Gaza caused by Israel. And this might be a confusing conflict for many people in the electorate, and there might be many people in the community who are concerned about it but not swayed about it either way. But it's the way that all of this has been played out politically in Australian politics. The debate and discussions about anti-Semitism have been contorted. The Gaza conflict has been twisted and used politically by the Liberal Party and Peter Dutton. And I think there's no question that the Prime Minister and the Federal Minister, Senator Penny Wong, have been totally supportive and appeased the Israel and Zionist lobby groups in Australia at the expense of Islamic and pro-Palestine groups, but there hasn't been any political benefit to the Labor government for doing this. And just this week, Anthony Albanese was in Melbourne to meet with the Jewish community from the Adass Israel synagogue after it was firebombed by unknown attackers, and there have been some suggestions that this might have been a false flag attack. That's not me saying that, that's just other people that have been reporting on that. And while the Prime Minister was there, generally the response was positive, but he was also abused by Zionist extremists. He was blamed for being too pro-Palestine. He was accused of creating the conditions for the firebomb, accused of not doing enough to stop anti-Semitism, accused of just turning up for the sake of a photo opportunity. And then this all became the negative news headlines all across the nation. And I just think that this is another example of the results of appeasement and choosing sides in politics. Same as that one-sided support for News Corporation. You just do not get anything back from these people. You do more and they abuse you more. You know, offer money to rebuild the Melbourne synagogue, and I'd say that that's probably going to be a blank check, or, you know, that's not enough. Albanese, I think, could have rebuilt the synagogue with his own bare hands and given them $10 million of his own money, and that still would never be enough. So the more you give, the more they want, whether it's News Corporation or the Zionists in Melbourne. And I think that policy of appeasement, I think that's a lesson that Albanese should have learnt by now, but just hasn't.
The other thing to point out about Al-Adass synagogue is that it was apparently pro-Palestinian and anti-Israeli expansion. So a very odd synagogue for a pro-Palestinian group to bomb. Now, before I get accused of putting my tinfoil hat on, the group may have just picked any old synagogue and not known what it was and picked the wrong one. These things happen. It did seem a bit suspicious, though, that of all the synagogues in Melbourne, it's just odd that it was that synagogue. I think, too, that the Prime Minister was unwise to make any definite calls until the investigation had been done. For all we know, it could have been an aggrieved member of the synagogue. We don't know that it was a terrorist attack, and we certainly don't know that it was perpetrated by anti-Jewish racism.
I guess overall we're just trying to look at this through the political lens, and I'm not suggesting that Albanese should do nothing about anti-Semitism, but me
either.
But he has chosen to support the Israel community in Australia and pretty much ignore the Islamic and Palestinian communities. And despite all of this, there just has been absolutely no political benefit in doing this. And I'd say that it actually made it worse for himself. It made him look weak. It made it look like he was caving into Israeli interests and a very powerful Zionist lobby group. And it actually was weak. And a good Prime Minister should be able to navigate a way to support all communities. But for most of this year, it was a case where any small support for Palestine was seen as anathema to him, even though he'd been a vocal supporter of the state of Palestine when he was a backbencher and as recently as 2019. But Peter Dutton, on the other hand, well, he just goes in there and prizes all of these issues wide open. He's racist, he's partisan, he's divisive. He's got absolutely no qualms about going in there and causing and creating havoc. And he's an absolute arsehole on this issue, but everyone knows where he stands. Albanese is sort of mealy-mouthed about Palestine. He's trying to fully commit to Israel, even though, in my opinion, that's morally a mistake. And it just seems that on this issue, it doesn't really matter what the Prime Minister does. He was in Perth on the weekend, and he was there for long enough to be photographed playing tennis. And the argument was that he was playing tennis when he should have been in Melbourne at the synagogue. And honestly, David, if you're going to play tennis, we'll do it in private or make sure that there is no one there to take a photograph. And
God forbid a 60-year-old man be active.
yeah, and then when he got to Melbourne 4 days later, well, he was abused anyway. So this is all a political mess for the Prime Minister. These are the decisions he's made, but I think by siding 100% with the pro-Israel and pro-Zionist community, he's made a big mistake. Not just a moral mistake, but a big political mistake as well.
Yeah,
And it just gets back to what we've always said. Just do the right thing in the first place and everything else will follow through.
condemning the attack is appropriate, but then to say I feel that it's a anti-Semitic attack, we don't know that. And that's not to say it's not, and if it comes out that it was, I'm not going to say, I was wrong. I'm not stating that it wasn't. I'm just saying we need to have a proper criminal investigation before the story gets out. And I don't know that the right thing is to say, well, we definitely know it was this group who did that without good solid evidence. When it goes to court, you may find that the motives are totally different. And again, it's contemptible and it should be condemned. But you condemn it as an attack, and then as the details come out, you can then continue to condemn it as, yes, this was an anti-Semitic attack, or this was a false flag, or this was a personal attack on someone and they tried to hide it as a terrorist attack to deflect attention from them, or this was whatever it was. Even when it seems obvious, you shouldn't comment till the police investigation is completely finished. And the investigation shouldn't be a whitewash. An Islamic school bus was bombed in Adelaide, yet we hear nothing about that. Burger Tree in Melbourne was bombed allegedly because of the owner's pro-Palestinian views. But we didn't hear anything about that. And if it was terrorism, it's as disgusting as bombing the synagogue. I'll also be clear here, it's not any worse or any better. It is a level of awfulness that it is the very lowest of, or the very worst of acts. And it doesn't matter who it's perpetrated against or even why. People should be able to go to their place of worship in safety and peace, even if I disagree with the place of worship. If you are on a school bus, you should be able to get back to your school bus or go to your school bus in the morning and have it there without it having been burnt to the ground. And if you're a business owner, you should be able to run a legal business. And hamburgers, last I saw, were legal. You should be able to run a business without fear of it being burnt down. And I think that there's too much jumping to conclusions.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
And there were many issues that were ignored throughout the year. We didn't hear much about women's issues and women's rights, not very much about climate change. We didn't hear very much about education funding reform. There were those changes to HECS debts, but that's only if the government wins the next election. There has been a little bit of noise about early education reform and universal childcare, but that announcement didn't come up until mid-December, and it also won't come in unless the government wins the next election. And it's almost like the government just didn't care enough about this to make it a big enough issue. But for me, the most obvious issue that was missing in action this year is Indigenous issues, where after the failure of the Voice of Parliament last year, the government decided that it's best to say nothing at all. And about the only thing that we did hear about Indigenous issues was when Peter Dutton finally announced a policy. And that policy was that if he does become Prime Minister, he will not be standing in front of an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flag, even though they are official Australian flags and have been since 1995. So that's the most important thing in the world for the Liberal Party at the moment. And the other issue was when Senator Lydia Thorpe said this to King Charles when he arrived in October this year.
You committed genocide against our people. Give us our land back. Give us what you stole from us. Our bones, our skulls, our babies, our people. You destroyed our land. Give us a treaty. We want a treaty in this country. You are a genocide. This is not your land. This is not your land. You are not my kids.
And during the year, Anthony Albanese also said that he never promised a Makarrata commission, even though that's clearly what he did say when he became Prime Minister. Here's what the Prime Minister said a few years ago, and then what he did say a few months ago.
The Uluru Statement contains another of the great keys with which we can unlock our potential going forward, a Makarrata Commission, which would oversee a national process of truth-telling, agreement and treaty-making. As a priority, Labor will establish a Makarrata Commission with responsibility for truth-telling and treaty.
With regard to Makarrata, a Yolngu word, that simply means a coming together after struggle. I'm somewhat perplexed at why people see that as being complex. Obviously, there has been a struggle for First Nations people. That's why we talk about closing the gap, or what is really a chasm in some areas. And coming together is a principle of walking together, that engagement. It's not a moment in time, it's a process of coming together after struggle.
So it's pretty obvious the government has decided there are no votes to be gained in supporting anything at all to do with Indigenous issues, and I think we can track the loss of support for this government with the loss of support for the Voice to Parliament last year, and they've never really recovered from that. Conversely, Peter Dutton does see a lot of votes to be gained by not supporting Indigenous policies, even to the point of not wanting to stand in front of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags because supposedly they are too divisive. So it's a pretty sad state of affairs, and as the journalist Laura Tingle did say this year to Howls of Outrage,
we are a racist country, let's face it, we always have been, and it's very depressing, but to give a licence like that I find profoundly depressing and a terrible prospect for the next election.
But we do have to remember that in Australia, it's a far greater crime to be accused of racism than the actual act of racism.
We're in a very strange position at the moment. I was emceeing a show the other day, and part of my duties was to give an acknowledgement of country. I was in a fairly conservative area with a relatively conservative audience. Nobody cared. Everyone appreciated the 30 seconds it took for me to acknowledge the traditional owners. I didn't get any feedback at all about what a terrible waste of time it is, and how it's an insult to those of us who've lived here and you don't need to acknowledge the land I live on. You'd think that this was the biggest type of outrage ever. I'm not sure that everybody there thought it should happen, but nobody thought it shouldn't happen. There's a slight difference between the two. I think Dutton is way overplaying his hand. Nearly every institution I've been involved with has been very proud to fly the Indigenous flag, and those that weren't came around to that opinion very quickly anyway.
Well, I think you are right. It's no longer a big deal about all of these different issues such as Welcome to Country or displaying the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags, but Peter Dutton is the one that wants to make this a divisive issue.
Yeah. He's trying to play into that sense of my entitlements are being stolen by people who aren't entitled to anything, that my inherent background is superior to everybody else's, and that these upstarts should be grateful for what they get. That was a little bit more in the Voice, because the Voice was able to be misrepresented. The Indigenous flag isn't really. And for those of us who are aware of it, it's a reminder just how important and how vital and how valuable the Indigenous contribution, and by that I mean Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, is to the country. And Australia should be very proud of its Indigenous heritage. And we should be very ashamed of how we've treated that till very, very recently, and even up to now. And the flag is a bit of a reminder of that too.
Show me my silver lining. I try to keep on keeping on. Show me my silver lining. I try to keep on keeping on. Show me my silver lining. I try to keep on keeping on.
And finally, we have to look at the performances of the leaders of the major political parties, and the opinion polls have been fairly static throughout most of the year, with a gradual shift towards the Liberal and National parties throughout the year. In December 2023, the average two-party preferred vote was 51% to Labor and 49% to the Liberal and National parties. And in December 2024, the positions are almost reversed, and the average is around either 50-50 or 51% to the Liberal National parties and 49% to the Labor Party. And this has been pretty much a slow drift throughout the year. It doesn't put the Liberal National Coalition in an election winning position at this stage. And we also have to remember that the election is not on right now. It's likely to be in May next year. So whatever is happening right now might not be relevant in 6 months' time. But I think it is reflective of that meandering that we've seen throughout this year. And this has resulted in quite a bit of disappointment within the electorate, but not enough, as far as I'm concerned, at this stage to throw the government out of office. And some of this is related to the performance of the economy and the cost of living issues, which have been ramped up by the media at every opportunity. And there is actually a lot of hostility towards the Prime Minister at the moment within the media, where every misstep, either real or imagined, is blown out of all proportion. And then the negative headlines follow. And we've pointed this out before. This government has been a good, competent government for most of its term, and sure, there have been some problems. It really failed on stamping out corruption, and we can see that with the ineptitude of the National Anti-Corruption Commission. The AUKUS disaster hasn't been looked at all, and I think dumping this would actually be beneficial to the Labor government. In New Zealand last week, the Labor Party over there said that it wouldn't have anything at all to do with AUKUS, and they're not actually part of it anyway, but they do have some peripheral relationships with the Australian military, and that position has garnered quite a lot of support in New Zealand, although we're not sure if that's because of AUKUS or it's because of something that New Zealand can use to rail against Australia in general. So Labor might have managed the economy relatively well, and maybe that's all it needs to do when it comes to the next election, but its inaction or poor political management on a lot of other issues is where the Prime Minister and the Labor government is losing support on. And that's where most of the disappointment, I think, comes from. And for someone who's been in politics for almost 29 years, Anthony Albanese just doesn't seem to have too much of a political antenna and doesn't seem to be aware of some of these problems.
For a Prime Minister who came in with a lot of political capital and a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of support, it seems to have nearly all gone. Now, Peter Dutton's not going to win the next election. There is one path, which includes winning seats back from a couple of Teals and winning a fairly safe Labor seat. It can be done, but I don't think it can be done while he's leader. I think that even the hold your nose and close your eyes voters, some things are just too strong and too bright for that to work.
Oh, but even still, Anthony Albanese should be in a much better position, especially when you look at his competition in Peter Dutton.
We can point to a whole range of reasons, and we have pointed to a whole range of reasons. But even with a soft press, Kevin Rudd was able to maintain over 55% for the whole of his first term. They got rid of him at 56%, which John Howard said he would have loved 55% at any time. He never got it. And yet Australia's second longest serving Prime Minister. Howard understood it was about doing what you believed in and massaging the right numbers, not trying to please everybody.
Oh, so do you feel that that's what Anthony Albanese's issues are, that he's just trying to appeal to everyone, and in that process of doing that, he's appealing to not very many?
Yeah, I think he's dissipating his political capital by spreading it too thin. Instead of focusing it, and this is true of all the ministry, by the way, instead of focusing it and burning it off in usable amounts and having a bit for the unexpected, instead he's managed to annoy nearly everyone. He's lost support on the left, he's lost support on the right, and he's lost support in the centre. I know that the Greens are smelling the blood in the air. Whether their vote can coalesce enough in enough seats to make a difference, I'm not sure. The Teal candidates, the new ones, I suspect, are going to do fairly well. Paul Fletcher stepped down to the sorrow of nobody, not even the Liberal Party. You could almost hear the sigh of relief that they didn't have to deal with him in this election. And they're looking like they're putting in a young, fairly moderate woman for the seat of Bradfield, which suggests that they might be starting to perhaps listen to a little bit of what Liberal voters want. But whether she's as moderate and as electorally viable remains to be seen. Even though I'm an opponent, it upsets me to see the Liberal Party self-destruct. I'd rather it be destroyed by outside forces through ideas, through debate, through better policy from the other side, than by self-destruction, and it just opens up a vacuum where someone worse can be brought in. And before you say there's nobody worse than Dutton, we didn't think there was anybody worse than Morrison. We didn't think there was anybody worse than Abbott. We didn't think there was anybody worse than Howard. So there is somebody out there who's worse than Dutton. I don't want to know who they are, and I don't want to see how they perform.
Well, I think it's a nice theory of devolution there, but I think with Peter Dutton, since we are talking about him, he's pretty much a policy vacuum. It's just that there's not much there, and I don't think that the Labor government has put enough sustained pressure on his leadership. You know, they do a little bit and then the pressure valve is released, and Peter Dutton should have been crucified much earlier on in this term. He shouldn't actually be in this position, and I realise that the media keeps pumping up his tyres, but the Dutton leadership should have been destroyed some time ago by the Labor government, but Anthony Albanese decided to be nice to him, do the bipartisan thing with Dutton, and I think the template for this was set up a long, long time ago, where earlier on in this parliamentary term, Albanese admonished Tanya Plibersek for calling Peter Dutton Voldemort, you know, from Harry Potter, and I think there's worse things that Peter Dutton could be called, but I think that just set up the template for respect for Peter Dutton that he does not deserve and will never reciprocate. So once again, we get this unusual support for Peter Dutton from Anthony Albanese, but there's just no political benefit to Albanese. All of the benefit is for Peter Dutton and the Liberal Party. It's the same process or it's the same behaviour as with News Corporation. It's the same process or behaviour with the Zionist lobby. All of this appeasement of the right and getting no political benefit in return. And because of this, Peter Dutton survives. And what has he actually got? All of this anti-woke culture war stuff, all the divisive behaviour, racism, no policies, railing against renewables, pushing an imaginary nuclear power industry. And it's almost like Albanese has forgotten how to play politics, but Peter Dutton certainly hasn't. And I think generally because of this situation, there is voter disengagement in the two-party political system and the business as usual process, and it has been like this for some time. I think that generally the electorate is looking at alternatives, and that's why the Australian Greens are getting traction, and that's why community-based independents are getting traction. People look at the federal government, they feel disappointed, they look at the Liberal Party opposition and they think, well, that's not for me, led by this vulgar, divisive, racist, culture war bloke. Well, I'll just go and vote for someone else. And I think this sort of thinking is going to be a lot more prevalent in the lead up to the next election.
I've said before, I think we've said before, the party system is dying.
I think we almost say it every week, David.
I think we do, yeah. The parties don't realise this. And instead of thinking, how can we reform to become relevant in the 21st century? And there's many options to that. You might look at policy change, you might look at structural change. You might look at membership change. You might look at all three of those. They're digging into what they know, and the world is moving on. One of the things that I get a positive out of the Trump election is that it's probably the last throw of the old party system. The Democrats are basically dead, even though they did very well in everything but the president, and they lose the House, but not by that much. But that party structure that has led them to 2 defeats against an unelectable crook means that they can't repeat the same mistakes ever again, because they won't survive the next one. And it's the same here. The party system, despite the fact that the parties are run by very passionate volunteers who desperately believe, but they're really propping up an entrenched system of privilege that has stopped helping more people than it harms. And I think that's the problem.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.